Now Terah lived 70 years and begot Abram, Nahor and Haran. My name's Arthur. Thank you for joining me as we turn to Genesis chapter 11, and we're reading the genealogy from Shem down to Abraham. This genealogy is very important because it gives us the ages as each generation was born, so that we can calculate the time of the flood relative to the time of Abraham. And on this basis we come to several key conclusions. First of all, that Abraham overlapped with Shem, and Jewish tradition, I understand, indicates that Abraham visited Shem, and so Abraham would have had first-hand account of the things that happened during the flood and of life before the flood, and been able to pass this information down in a written form for Moses to use as he compiled the records. But also it shows that God maintained a presence, first of all in Shem and then in Abram, and in the lives of others like Melchizedek, of knowledge about himself, even though the large majority of people in the world were disobedient to God. The population of the world would have increased very quickly. Starting with 8 people, there could easily have been 1,000, probably several thousand, after 100 years. And after 200 years, there would have been 1 million people in the world. Peleg, whose name was mentioned before the earth was divided in his time, was born 100 years after the flood. And so in his lifetime, the population of the earth increased dramatically, and the peoples distributed around the world, and territories were allocated. This is the genealogy of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and begot Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. After he begot Arphaxad, Shem lived 500 years and begot sons and daughters. Arphaxad lived 35 years and begot Selah. After he begot Selah, Arphaxad lived 403 years and begot sons and daughters. Selah lived 30 years and begot Eber. After he begot Eber, Selah lived 403 years and begot sons and daughters. Eber lived 34 years and begot Peleg. After he begot Peleg, Eber lived 430 years and begot sons and daughters. Peleg lived 30 years and begot Reu. After he begot Reu, Peleg lived 209 years and begot sons and daughters. Reu lived 32 years and begot Serag. After he begot Serag, Reu lived 207 years and begot sons and daughters. Serag lived 30 years and begot Nahor. After he begot Nahor, Serag lived 200 years and begot sons and daughters. Nahor lived 29 years and begot Terah. After he begot Terah, Nahor lived 119 years and begot sons and daughters. Now Terah lived 70 years, and he begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. This is the genealogy of Terah. Terah begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran begot Lot. And Haran died before his father Terah in his native land, in of the Chaldeans. Then Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and the father of Iscah. But Sarai was barren and had no child, and Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife, and they went out with them from of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. And they came to Haran and dwelt there. So the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. And may the Lord bless his word to us. Well, we have some interesting details here. First of all, Shem, as we've identified, was not the oldest of the three, and he was not the youngest. He was the middle one, and he was evidently born 2 years after Japheth, because he was in fact only 98 when the flood came. And so he was 100 2 years after the flood when Arphaxad was born. So we have Arphaxad, Salah, Eber from the word Hebrew comes, and Peleg. Peleg was born about 100 years after the flood, when the world population would have been about 1,000 or more. Each of these families had sons and daughters. At this early stage there was no prohibition from marrying sisters and brothers, and we actually find out in Abram's family that he married his half-sister, the daughter of his father but not his mother, and we also have Haran marrying his brother's daughter. Nahor's wife, Milcah, the daughter of Haran, who was Nahor's brother. So there was close marriages within the families. Now that wasn't a problem because at this very early stage the genetics of people was still in a very robust state. But we see a dramatic decrease in age. So Shem, who was born before the flood, lived 500 years after the flood. But without the upper atmosphere water canopy, radiation on the earth was much increased, and it had a very bad effect on the lives of people. So in a very few generations the ageing process is accelerated. The first couple of generations live for 400 years, but then it quickly drops to 200 years, and by the time we get to Moses it's down to 100, 120 years, whereas Abraham lived 175 years and Isaac lived 180 years. So the ages are quickly dropping down, and after the time of Moses they quickly drop down to 100 and to 70 years. And it's been maintained at that level ever since. Terah lived in Ur of the Chaldeans, an ancient site that's been excavated on the Euphrates River. The excavations there have been very fascinating. We're told, first of all, that Terah begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran begat Lot. And then Haran died while they were still in Ur of the Chaldeans. Terah lived 70 years and begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. But in actual fact, we find that Abram was not the oldest, and he was born some considerable time later. For we find that that Abram leaves Haran at the age of 75 years, which is when his father Terah died at 205 years. So this means that Terah was 130 actually when Abram was born. So there's a long period of time between the birth of Nahor and Haran and Abram. Also, the key aspect of the increase in the population was that these people had sons and daughters. They had large families. With a large family, then they could quickly establish, working together, to establish the communities. And we find the same thing happened when people settled in Australia. Typically, they had large families. There are a few large families today. My son-in-law is one of 11, and I've known several families with 7 children. But in these times, when you're moving into a new territory, you need lots of hands to do the various tasks that need to be done, and large families is the way that is achieved. What stands out then in the life of Abraham is that Sarai was barren, and so against the trend of the time, Sarai does not bear to Abram a multitude of children. The other bit of information that doesn't come from the scriptures but does come from the Jewish traditions is that Terah and Abraham were involved in worship of the sun and the moon in Ur, but they eventually realised how futile this was. Worshipping the sun, but you couldn't worship him during the night. Worshipping the moon, but you couldn't worship him during the day when he was not there. And so they realised that there was a greater God. And when they went to visit Shem, they learned details of that greater God. And so God spoke to Abram, "Get out of your country,